Section 2 of The Diamond Lens with Other Stories by Fitz James O'Brien. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Wondersmith. 1. Loch Street and its people. A small lane, the name of which I have forgotten, or do not choose to remember, slants suddenly off from Chatham Street, before that headlong thoroughfare rushes into the park, and retreats suddenly down toward the East River, as if it were disgusted with the smell of old clothes and had determined to wash itself clean. This excellent intention it has, however, evidently contributed toward the making of that imaginary pavement mentioned in the old adage, for it is still emphatically a dirty street. It has never been able to shake off the Hebraic taint of filth which it inherits from the ancestral thoroughfare. It is slushy and greasy, as if it were a twin brother of the Roman ghetto. I like a dirty slum, not because I am naturally unclean. I have not a drop of Neapolitan blood in my veins, but because I generally find a certain sediment of philosophy precipitated in its gutters. A clean street is terribly prosaic. There is no food for thought in carefully swept pavements, barren kennels, and vulgarly spotless houses. But when I go down a street which has been left so long to itself that it has acquired a distinct outward character, I find plenty to think about. The scraps of sodden letters lying in the ash barrel have their meaning. Desperate appeals, perhaps, from Tom, the baker's assistant, to Amelia, the daughter of the dry goods retailer, who is always selling at a sacrifice in consequence of the late fire. That may be Tom himself, who is now passing me in a white apron, and I look up at the windows of the house, which does not, however, give any signs of a recent conflagration, and almost hope to see Amelia wave a white pocket handkerchief. The bit of orange peel lying on the sidewalk inspires thought. Who will fall over it? Who but the industrious mother of 6 children, the youngest of which is only 9 months old, all of whom are dependent on her exertions for support? I see her slip and tumble. I see the pale face convulsed with agony, and the vain struggle to get up, the pitying crowd closing her off from all air, the anxious young doctor who happened to be passing by, the manipulation of the broken limb, the shake of the head, the moan of the victim, the litter borne on men's shoulders, the gates of the New York hospital unclosing, the subscription taken up on the spot. There is some food for speculation in that 3-year-old tattered child masked with dirt, who is throwing a brick at another 3-year-old tattered child masked with dirt. It is not difficult to perceive that he is destined to lurk, as it were, through life. His bad flat face, or at least what can be seen of it, does not look as if it were made for the light of day. The mire in which he wallows now is but a type of the moral mire in which he will wallow hereafter. The feeble little hand lifted at this instant to smite his companion, half in earnest, half in jest, will be raised against his fellow beings forevermore. Loch Street, as I will call this nameless lane before alluded to, is an interesting locality. All the oddities of trade seem to have found their way thither and made an eccentric mercantile settlement. There is a bird shop at one corner wainscoted with little cages containing linnets, waxwings, canaries, blackbirds, minnow-birds with 100 other varieties, known only to naturalists. Immediately opposite is an establishment where they sell nothing but ornaments made out of the tinted leaves of autumn, varnished and gummed into various forms. Further down is a second-hand bookstall, which looks like a sentry box mangled out flat, and which is remarkable for not containing a complete set of any work. There is a small chink between 2 ordinary-sized houses, in which a little Frenchman makes and sells artificial eyes, specimens of which, ranged on a black velvet cushion, stare at you unwinkingly through the window as you pass, until you shudder and hurry on, thinking how awful the world would be if everyone went about without eyelids. There are junk shops in Loch Street that seem to have gotten hold of all of the old nails in the ark and all the old brass of Corinth. Madame Philomel, the fortune-teller, lives at number 12 Loch Street, 2nd Street front. Pull the bell on the left-hand side. Next door to Madame is the shop of Herr Heap, commonly called the Wondersmith. Herr Heap's shop is the largest in Loch Street, and to all appearance is furnished with the smallest stock. Beyond a few packing cases, a turner's lathe, and a shelf laden with dissected maps of Europe, the interior of the shop is entirely unfurnished. The window, which is lofty and wide, but much begrimed with dirt, contains the only pleasant object in the place. This is a beautiful little miniature theatre, that is to say, the orchestra and stage. It is fitted with charmingly painted scenery and all the appliances for scenic changes. There are tiny traps and delicately constructed lifts, and real footlights fed with burning fluid. And in the orchestra sits a diminutive conductor before his desk, surrounded by musical mannequins, all provided with the smallest of violoncellos, flutes, oboes, drums, and such like. There are characters also on the stage. A Templar in a white cloak is dragging a fainting female form to the parapet of a ruined bridge, while behind a great black rock on the left one can see a man concealed who, kneeling, levels an arquebus at the knight's heart. But the orchestra is silent, the conductor never beats the time, the musicians never play a note. The Templar never drags his victim an inch nearer to the bridge. The masked avenger takes an eternal aim with his weapon. This repose appears unnatural, for so admirably are the figures executed that they seem replete with life. One is almost led to believe, in looking on them, that they are resting beneath some spell which hinders their motion. One expects every moment to hear the loud explosion of the arquebus, to see the blue smoke curling, the Templar falling, to hear the orchestra playing the requiem of the guilty. Few people know what Herr Heap's business or trade really was. That he worked at something was evident, else why the shop? Some people inclined to the belief that he was an inventor, or mechanician. His workshop was in the rear of the store, and into that sanctuary no one but himself had admission. He arrived in Loch Street 8 or 10 years ago, and one fine morning the neighbors, taking down their shutters, observed that number 13 had got a tenant. A tall, thin, sallow-faced man stood on a ladder outside the shop entrance, nailing up a large board on which Herr Heap, Wondersmith, was painted in black letters on a yellow background. The little theatre stood in the window where it stood ever after, and Herr Heap was established. But what was a wondersmith? People asked each other. No one could reply. Madame Philomel was consulted, but she looked grave and said that it was none of her business. Mr. Pipple, the bird-fancier, who was a German, and ought to know best, thought it was the English for some singular Teutonic profession, but his replies were so vague that Loch Street was as unsatisfied as ever. Solon, the little humpback, who kept the odd-volume bookstall at the lowest corner, could throw no light upon it, and at length people had to come to the conclusion that Herr Heap was either a quiner or a magician, and opinions were divided. 2. A bottle full of souls. It was a dull December evening. There was little trade doing in Loch Street, and the shutters were up at most of the shops. Heap's store had been closed at least an hour, and the minnow birds and bohemian waxwings at Mr. Pipple's had their heads tucked under their wings in their first sleep. Herr Heap sat in his parlour, which was lit by a pleasant wood fire. There were no candles in the room, and the flickering blaze played fantastic tricks on the pale grey walls. It seemed the festival of shadows. Processions of shapes, obscure and indistinct, passed across the leaden-hued panels and vanished in the dusk corners. Every fresh blaze flung up by the wayward logs created new images. Now it was a funeral throng, with the bowed figures of mourners, the shrouded coffin, the plumes that waved like extinguished torches. Now a nightly cavalcade with flags and lances and weird horses that rushed silently along until they met the angle of the room, when they pranced through the wall and vanished. On a table close to where Herr Heap sat was placed a large square box of some dark wood, while over it was spread a casing of steel, so elaborately wrought in an open arabesque pattern that it seemed like a shining blue lace which was lightly stretched over its surface. Herr Heap lay luxuriously in his armchair, looking meditatively in the fire. He was tall and thin, and his skin was of a dull saffron hue. Long straight hair, sharply cut, regular features, a long thin moustache that curled like a dark asp around his mouth, the expression of which was so bitter and cruel that it seemed to distill the venom of the ideal serpent, and a bony, muscular form were the prominent characteristics of the Wondersmith. The profound silence that reigned in the chamber was broken by a peculiar scratching at the panel of the door, like that which, at the French court, was formerly substituted for the ordinary knock, when it was necessary to demand admission to the royal apartments. Herr Heap started, raised his head, which vibrated on his long neck like the head of a cobra when about to strike, and after a moment's silence uttered a strange guttural sound. The door unclosed, and a squat, broad-shouldered woman with large, wild, oriental eyes entered softly. "Ah, Philomel, you are come," said the Wondersmith, sinking back in his chair. "Where are the rest of them?" "They will be here presently," answered Madame Philomel, seating herself in an armchair much too narrow for a person of her proportions, and over the sides of which she bulged like a pudding. "Have you brought the souls?" asked the Wondersmith. "They are here," said the fortune-teller, drawing a large pot-bellied black bottle from under her cloak. "Ah, I have had such trouble with them." "Are they of the right brand? Wild, tearing, dark, devilish fellows. We want no essence of milk and honey, you know. None but souls bitter as hemlock or scorching as lightning will suit our purpose." You will see, Grand Duke of Egypt. They are ethereal demons, every one of them. They are the pick of 1,000 births. Do you think that I, old midwife that I am, don't know the squall of the demon child from that of the angel child the very moment they're delivered? Ask a musician how he knows, even in the dark, a note struck by Thalberg from one struck by Liszt. I long to test them, cried the Wondersmith, rubbing his hands joyfully. I long to see how the little devils will behave when I give them their shapes. Ah, it will be a proud day for us when we let them loose upon the cursed Christian children. Through the length and breadth of the land they will go, wherever our wandering people set foot, and wherever they are, the children of the Christians shall die. Then we, the despised Bohemians, the gypsies, as they call us, will be once more lords of the earth, as we were in the days when the accursed things called cities did not exist, and men lived in the free woods and haunted the game of the forest. Toys, indeed. Aye, we will give the little dears toys. Toys that all day will sleep calmly in their boxes, seemingly stiff and wooden and without life, but at night when the souls enter them, will arise and surround the cots of the sleeping children, and pierce their hearts with their keen, envenomed blades. Toys, indeed. Oh, yes, I will sell them toys. And the Wondersmith laughed horribly, while the snaky mustache on his upper lip writhed as if it had truly a serpent's power and could sting. "Have you got your first batch, Herr Heap?" asked Madame Philomel. "Are they all ready?" "Oh, aye, they are ready," answered the Wondersmith with gusto, opening as he spoke the box covered with the blue steel lacework. "They are here." The box contained a quantity of exquisitely carved wooden mannequins of both sexes, painted with great dexterity so as to present a miniature resemblance to nature. They were, in fact, nothing more than admirable specimens of those toys which children delight in placing in various positions on the table, in regiments, or sitting at meals, or grouped under the stiff green trees which always accompany them in the boxes in which they are sold at the toy shops. The peculiarity, however, about the mannequins of Herr Heap was not alone the artistic truth with which the limbs and features were gifted, but on the countenance of each little puppet the carver's art had wrought an expression of wickedness that was appalling. Every tiny face had its special stamp of ferocity. The lips were thin and brimful of malice. The small black bead-like eyes glittered with the fire of universal hate. There was not one of the mannequins, male or female, that did not hold in his or her hand some miniature weapon. The little men, scowling like demons, clasped in their wooden fingers swords delicate as a housewife's needle. The women, whose countenances expressed treachery and cruelty, clutched infinitesimal daggers, with which they seemed about to take some terrible vengeance. "Good," said Madame Philomel, taking one of the mannequins out of the box, and examining it attentively. "You work well, Duke Balthazar. These little ones are of the right stamp. They look as if they had mischief in them. Ah, here comes our brothers." At this moment the same scratching that preceded the entrance of Madame Philomel was heard at the door, and Herr Heap replied with a hoarse guttural cry. The next moment 2 men entered. The first was a small man with very brilliant eyes. He was wrapped in a long, shabby cloak and wore a strange, nondescript species of cap on his head, such a cap as one sees only in the low billiard-rooms in Paris. His companion was tall, long-limbed, and slender, and his dress, although of the ordinary cut, either from the disposition of colors or from the careless, graceful attitudes of the wearer, assumed a certain air of picturesqueness. Both the men possessed the same marked oriental type of countenance which distinguished the Wondersmith and Madame Philomel. True gypsies they seemed, who would not have been out of place telling fortunes or stealing chickens in the green lanes of England, or wandering with their wild music and their sleight of hand tricks through Bohemian villages. "Welcome, brothers," said the Wondersmith. "You are in time. Sister Philomel has brought the souls, and we are about to test them. Monsieur Coplon, take off your cloak. Brother Oaksmith, take a chair. I promise you some amusement this evening, so make yourselves comfortable. Here is something to aid you." And while the Frenchman, Coplon, and his tall companion, Oaksmith, were obeying Heap's invitation, he reached over to a little closet let into the wall, and took thence a squat bottle and some glasses, which he placed on the table. "Drink, brothers," he said. "It is not Christian blood, but good stout wine of Oporto. It goes right to the heart, and warms one like the sunshine of the south." "It is a good," said Coplon, smacking his lips with enthusiasm. "Why don't you keep brandy? Hang wine!" cried Oaksmith, after having swallowed 2 bumpers in rapid succession. "Bah! Brandy has been the ruin of our race. It made us sots and thieves."
It shall never cross my threshold," cried the Wondersmith, with a sombre indignation.
"A little of it is not bad, though, Duke," said the fortune-teller. "It consoles us for our misfortunes. It gives us the crowns we once wore. It restores us to the power we once wielded. It carries us back, as if by magic, to that land of the sun from which fate has driven us. It darkens the memory of all the evils that we have for centuries suffered."
"It is a devil! May it be cursed!"
cried Herr Heap, passionately.
"It is a demon that stole from me my son, the finest youth in all Courland. Yes, my son, the son of the wayward Balthazar, Grand Duke of Lower Egypt, died raving in a gutter, with an empty brandy bottle in his hands. Were it not that the plant is a sacred one in our race, I would curse the grape and the vine that bore it."
This outburst was delivered with such energy that the three gypsies kept silence. Oaksmith helped himself to another glass of port, and the fortune-teller rocked to and fro in her chair, too much overawed by the Wondersmith's vehemence of manner to reply. The little Frenchman, Corplon, took no part in the discussion, but seemed lost in admiration of the mannikins, which he took from the box in which they lay, handling them with the greatest care. After the silence had lasted for about a minute, Herr Heap broke it with the sudden question,
"How does your eye get on, Corplon?"
"Excellently, Duke. It is finished. I have it here."
And the little Frenchman put his hand into his breeches pocket and pulled out a large artificial human eye. Its great size was the only thing in this eye that would lead anyone to suspect its artificiality. It was at least twice the size of life, but there was a fearful speculative light in its iris, which seemed to expand and contract like the eye of a living being that rendered it a horrible staring paradox. It looked like the naked eye of the Cyclops, torn from his forehead, and still burning with wrath and the desire for vengeance. The little Frenchman laughed pleasantly as he held the eye in his hand, and gazed down on that huge dark pupil that stared back at him, it seemed, with an air of defiance and mistrust.
"It is a devil of an eye,"
said the little man, wiping the enameled surface with an old silk pocket-handkerchief.
"It reads like a demon. My niece, the unhappy one, has a wretch of a lover, and I have a long time feared that she would run away with him. I could not read her correspondence, for she kept her writing desk closely locked, but I asked her yesterday to keep this eye in some very safe place for me. She put it, as I knew she would, into her desk, and by its aid I read every one of her letters. She was to run away next Monday, the ungrateful, but she will find herself disappointed."
And the little man laughed heartily at the success of his stratagem, and polished and fondled the great eye until that optic seemed to grow sore with rubbing.
"And you have been at work too, I see, Herr Heap. Your mannikins are excellent. But where are the souls?" "In that bottle,"
answered the Wondersmith, pointing to the pot-bellied black bottle that Madame Philomel had brought with her.
"Yes, Monsieur Corplon," he continued, "my mannikins are well made. I invoked the aid of Abigor, the demon of soldiery, and he inspired me. The little fellows will be famous assassins when they are animated. We will try them tonight."
"Good,"
cried Corplon, rubbing his hands joyously.
"It is close upon New Year's Day. We will fabricate millions of the little murderers by New Year's Eve, and sell them in large quantities. And when the households are asleep, and the Christian children are waiting for Santa Claus to come, the small ones will troop from their boxes, and the Christian children will die. It is famous. Health to Abigor."
"Let us try them at once," said Oaksmith. "Is your daughter, Zonella, in bed, Herr Heap? Are we secure from intrusion?"
"No one is stirring about the house,"
replied the Wondersmith gloomily. Philomel leaned over to Oaksmith and said in an undertone, "Why do you mention his daughter? You know he does not like to have her spoken about."
"I will take care that we are not disturbed,"
said Corplon, rising.
"I will put my eye outside the door to watch."
He went to the door and placed his great eye upon the floor with tender care. As he did so, a dark form, unseen by him or his second vision, glided along the passage noiselessly, and was lost in the darkness. "Now for it!" exclaimed Madame Philomel, taking up her fat black bottle. "Herr Heap, prepare your mannikins." The Wondersmith took the little dolls out one by one and set them upon the table. Such an array of villainous countenances was never seen. An army of Italian bravos, seen through the wrong end of a telescope, or a band of prisoners at the galleys in Lilliput, will give some faint idea of the appearance they presented. While Madame Philomel uncorked the black bottles, Herr Heap covered the dolls with a species of linen tint, which he took also from the box. This done, the fortune-teller held the mouth of the bottle to the door of the tent, gathering the loose cloth closely round the glass neck. Immediately tiny noises were heard inside the tent. Madame Philomel removed the bottle, and the Wondersmith lifted the covering in which he had enveloped his little people. A wonderful transformation had taken place. Wooden and inflexible no longer, the crowd of mannequins were now in full motion. The bead-like eyes turned, glittering on all sides. The thin, wicked lips quivered with bad passions. The tiny hands sheathed and unsheathed little swords and daggers. Episodes common to life were taking place in every direction. Here 2 martial mannequins paid court to a pretty, sly-faced female, who smiled on each alternately, but gave her hand to be kissed to a third mannequin, an ugly little scoundrel who crouched behind her. There a pair of friendly dolls walked arm in arm, apparently on the best terms, while all the time one was watching his opportunity to stab the other in the back.
"I think they'll do," said the Wondersmith, chuckling as he watched these various incidents. "Treacherous, cruel, bloodthirsty, all goes marvellously well. But stay, I will put the grand test to them."
So saying, he drew a gold dollar from his pocket and let it fall on the table, in the very midst of the throng of mannequins. It had hardly touched the table when there was a pause on all sides. Every head was turned towards the dollar. Then about 20 of the little creatures rushed towards the glittering coin. One, fleeter than the rest, leaped upon it and drew his sword. The entire crowd of little people had now gathered round this new center of attraction. Men and women struggled and shoved to get nearer to the piece of gold. Hardly had the first Lilliputian mounted upon the treasure, when 100 blades flashed back a defiant answer to his, and a dozen men, sword in hand, leaped upon the yellow platform, and drove him off at the sword's point. Then commenced a general battle. The miniature faces were convulsed with rage and avarice. Each furious doll tried to plunge dagger or sword into his or her neighbor, and the women seemed possessed by 1,000 devils. "They will break themselves into atoms," cried Philomel as she watched with eagerness the savage melee. "You had better gather them up, Herr Heap. I will exhaust my bottle and suck all the souls back from them."
"Oh, they are perfect devils. They are magnificent little demons,"
cried the Frenchman with enthusiasm.
"Heap, you are a wonderful man. Brother Oaksmith, you have no such man as Heap among your English gypsies."
"Not exactly," answered Oaksmith rather suddenly. "Not exactly. But we have men there who can make a 12-year-old horse look like a 4-year-old, and who can take you and Herr Heap with one hand and throw you over their shoulders."
"The good God forbid,"
said the little Frenchman. "I do not love such play. It is incommodious."
While Oaksmith and Kerplon were talking, the Wondersmith had placed the linen tent over the struggling dolls, and Madame Philomel, who had been performing some mysterious manipulations with her black bottle, put the mouth once more to the door of the tent. In an instant the confused murmur within ceased. Madame Philomel corked the bottle quickly. The Wondersmith withdrew the tent, and, lo, the furious dolls were once more wooden-jointed and inflexible. And the old sinister look was again frozen on their faces.
"They must have blood, though," said Herr Heap, as he gathered them up and put them into their box. "Mr. Pipple, the bird fancier, is asleep. I have a key that opens his door. We will let them loose among the birds. It will be rare fun."
"Magnificent,"
cried Kerplon.
"Let us go on the instant, but first let me gather up my eye."
The Frenchman pocketed his eye, after having given it a polish with the silk handkerchief. Herr Heap extinguished the lamp. Oaksmith took a last bumper of port, and the 4 gypsies departed for Mr. Pipple's, carrying the box of mannequins with them. 3. Salon. The shadow that glided along the dark corridor at the moment that Monsieur Kerplon deposited his sentinel eye outside the door of the Wondersmith's apartment sped swiftly through the passage and ascended the stairs to the attic. Here the shadow stopped at the entrance to one of the chambers and knocked at the door. There was no reply.
"Zonela, are you asleep?"
said the shadow softly.
"Oh, Salon, is it you?"
replied a sweet low voice from within.
"I thought it was Herr Heap. Come in."
The shadow opened the door and entered. There were neither candles nor lamp in the room, but through the projecting window which was open there came the faint gleams of the starlight, by which one could distinguish a female figure seated on a low stool in the middle of the floor.
"Has he left you without light again, Zonela?" asked the shadow, closing the door of the apartment. "I've brought my little lantern with me, though."
"Thank you, Salon,"
answered she called Zanella.
"You are a good fellow. He never gives me any light of an evening, but bids me to go to bed. I like to sit sometimes and look at the moon and the stars more than all, for they seem all the time to look right back into my face, very sadly, as if they would say, 'We see you, and pity you, and would help you if we could.' But it is so mournful to be always looking at such myriads of melancholy eyes, and I long so to read those nice books that you lend me, Salon."
By this time the shadow had lit the lantern and was a shadow no longer. a large head covered with a profusion of long blonde hair which was cut after that fashion known as a l'enfant d'Edouard. A beautiful pale face lit with wide blue dreamy eyes, long arms and slender hands, attenuated legs, and an enormous hump. Such was Solon, the shadow. As soon as the humpback had lit the lamp, Zonella arose from the low stool on which she had been seated, and took Solon's hand affectionately in hers. Zonella was surely not of gypsy blood. That rich auburn hair, that looked almost black in the lamplight, that pale transparent skin tinged with an underglow of warm rich blood, the hazel eyes, large and soft as those of a fawn, were never begotten of a Zingaro. Zonella was seemingly about 16. Her figure, although somewhat thin and angular, was full of the unconscious grace of youth. She was dressed in an old cotton print which had once been of an exceedingly boisterous pattern, but was now a mere suggestion of former splendor, while round her head was twisted in fantastic fashion a silk handkerchief of green ground spotted with bright crimson. This strange headdress gave her an elfish appearance.
"I have been out all day with the organ, and I am so tired, Solon. Not sleepy, but weary, I mean. Poor Furbellow was sleepy, though, and he's gone to bed."
"I am weary too, Zonella. Not weary as you are, though, for I sit in my little bookstall all day long, and do not drag round an organ and a monkey and play old tunes for pennies. But weary of myself, of life, of the load that I carry on my shoulders." And as he said this, the poor humpback glanced sideways, as if to call attention to his deformed person.
"Well, but you ought not to be melancholy amidst your books, Solon. Gracious, if I could only sit in the sun and read as you do, how happy I should be. But it's very tiresome to trudge round all day with that nasty organ, and look up at the houses, and know that you are annoying the people inside, and then the boys play such bad tricks on poor Furbellow, throwing him hot pennies to pick up, and burning his poor little hands. And oh, sometimes, Solon, the men in the street make me so afraid. They speak to me and look at me so oddly. I'd a great deal rather sit in your bookstall and read."
"I have nothing but odd volumes in my stall," answered the humpback. "Perhaps that's right, though, for, after all, I'm nothing but an odd volume myself."
"Come, don't be melancholy, Solon. Sit down and tell me a story. I'll bring Furbellow to listen."
So saying, she went to a dusky corner of the cheerless attic room, and returned with a little Brazilian monkey in her arms, a poor, mild, drowsy thing that looked as if it had cried itself to sleep. She sat down on her little stool with Furbellow in her lap, and nodded her head to Solon, as much to say, "Go on, we are attentive." "You want a story, do you?" said the humpback with a mournful smile. "Well, I'll tell you one. Only what will your father say if he catches me here?"
"Herr Heap is not my father," cried Zonella indignantly. "He's a gypsy, and I know I'm stolen, and I'd run away from him if only I knew where to run to. If I were his child, do you think that he would treat me as he does, make me trudge round the city all day long with a barrel organ and a monkey, though I love poor dear Furbellow, and keep me up in a garret and give me ever so little to eat? I know I'm not his child, for he hates me." "Listen to my story, Zonella, and we'll talk of that afterwards. Let me sit at your feet." And having coiled himself up at the dark maiden's feet, he commenced. "There once lived in the great city, just like this city of New York, a poor little hunchback. He kept a second-hand bookstall where he made barely enough money to keep body and soul together. He was very sad at times, because he knew scarce anyone, and those that he did know did not love him. He had passed a sickly, secluded youth. The children of his neighborhood would not play with him, for he was not made like them, and the people in the streets stared at him with pity, or scoffed at him when he went by. Ah, Zonella, how his poor heart was wrung with bitterness when he beheld the procession of shapely men and fine women that every day passed him by in the thoroughfares of the great city. How he repined and cursed his fate as the torrent of fleet-footed firemen dashed past him to the toll of the bells, magnificent in their overflowing vitality and strength. But there was one consolation left him, one drop of honey in the jar of gall, so sweet that it ameliorated all the bitterness of life. God had given him a deformed body, but his mind was straight and healthy. So the poor hunchback shut himself into the world of books, and was, if not happy, at least contented. He kept company with courteous paladins and romantic heroes and beautiful women, and this society was of such excellent breeding that it never so much as once noticed his poor crooked back or his lame walk. The love of books grew upon him with his years. He was remarked for his studious habits.
And when one day the obscure people that he called father and mother, parents only in name, died, a compassionate book vendor gave him enough stock in trade to set up a little stall of his own. Here, in his bookstall, he sat in the sun all day, waiting for the customers that seldom came, and reading the fine deeds of the people of the ancient time, or the beautiful thoughts of the poets that had warmed millions of hearts before that hour, and still glowed for him with undiminished fire. One day when he was reading some book that, small as it was big enough to shut the whole world out from him, he heard some music in the street. Looking up from his book, he saw a little girl with large eyes playing an organ, while a monkey begged for alms from a crowd of idlers who had nothing in their pockets but their hands. The girl was playing, but she was also weeping. The merry notes of the polka were ground out to a silent accompaniment of tears. She looked very sad, this organ girl, and her monkey seemed to have caught the infection, for his large brown eyes were moist, as if he also wept. The poor hunchback was struck with pity, and called the little girl over to give her a penny, not, dear Zonella, because he wished to bestow alms, but because he wanted to speak with her. She came, and they talked together. She came the next day, for it turned out that they were neighbors, and the next, and in short, every day. They became friends. They were both lonely and afflicted, with this difference, that she was beautiful, and he was a hunchback.
"Why, Solon," cried Zonella, "that's the very way you and I met."
It was then, continued Solon with a faint smile, that life seemed to have its music. A great harmony seemed to the poor cripple to fill the world. The carts that took the flour barrels from the wharves to the storehouses seemed to emit joyous melodies from their wheels. The hum of the great business streets sounded like grand symphonies of triumph. As one who has been travelling through a barren country without much heed feels with singular force the sterility of the lands he has passed through when he reaches the fertile plains that lie at the end of his journey, so the humpback, after his vision had been freshened with this blooming flower, remembered for the first time the misery of the life that he had led. But he did not allow himself to dwell upon the past. The present was so delightful that it occupied all his thoughts. Zonella, he was in love with the organ girl.
"Oh, that's so nice,"
said Zonella innocently, pinching poor Furbellow as she spoke in order to dispel a very evident snooze that was creeping over him.
"It's going to be a love story."
Ah, but, Zonella, he did not know whether she loved him in return. You forget that he was deformed.
"But,"
answered the girl gravely,
"he was good."
A light like the flash of an aurora illuminated Solon's face for an instant. He put out his hand suddenly, as if to take Zonella's and press it to his heart. But an unaccountable timidity seemed to arrest the impulse, and he only stroked Furbellow's head, upon which that individual opened one large brown eye to the extent of the eighth of an inch, and seeing that it was only Solon, instantly closed it again, and resumed his dream of a city where there were no organs, and all the copper coin of the realm was iced. He hoped and feared, continued Solon, in a low, mournful voice, but at times he was very miserable, because he did not think it possible that so much happiness was reserved for him as the love of this beautiful, innocent girl. At time when he was in bed and all the world was dreaming, he lay awake, looking up at the old books against the walls, thinking how he could bring about the charming of her heart. One night when he was thinking of this, with his eyes fixed upon the mouldy backs of the odd volumes that lay on their shelves, and looked back at him wistfully as if they would say, "We are also like you and wait to be completed," it seemed as if he heard a rustle of leaves. Then, one by one, the books came down from their places to the floor, as if shifted by invisible hands, opened their worm-eaten covers, and from between the pages of each the hunchback saw issued forth a curious throng of little people that danced here and there through the apartment. Each one of these little creatures was shaped so as to bear resemblance to some of the letters of the alphabet. One tall, long-legged fellow seemed like the letter A. A burly fellow with a big head and a paunch was the model of B. Another leering little chap might have passed for a Q, and so on through the whole. These fairies, for fairies they were, climbed upon the hunchback's bed and clustered thick as bees upon his pillow.
"Come," they cried to him, "we will lead you into fairyland."
So saying, they seized his hand, and he suddenly found himself in a beautiful country, where the light did not come from sun or moon or stars, but floated round and over and in everything like the atmosphere. On all sides he heard mysterious melodies sung by strange musical voices. None of the features of the landscape was definite. Yet, when he looked on the vague harmonies of colour that melted one into another before his sight, he was filled with a sense of inexplicable beauty. On every side of him fluttered radiant bodies, which darted to and fro through the illumined space. They were not birds, yet they flew like birds, and as each one crossed the path of his vision, he felt a strange delight flash through his brain, and straightway an interior voice seemed to sing beneath the vaulted dome of his temples a verse containing some beautiful thought. The little fairies were all this time dancing and fluttering around him, perching on his head, on his shoulders, or balancing themselves on his fingertips. "Where am I?" he asked at last of his friends, the fairies.
"Ah, Salon,"
he heard them whisper, in tones that sounded like the distant tinkling of silver bells.
"this land is nameless, but those whom we lead hither, who tread its soil, and breathe its air, and gaze on its floating sparks of light, are poets forevermore."
Having said this, they vanished, and with them the beautiful, indefinite land, and the flashing lights, and the illumined air, and the hunchback found himself again in bed with the moonlight quivering on the floor, and the dusty books on their shelves grim and mouldy as ever.
"You have betrayed yourself. You called yourself Solon," cried Zanella. "Was it a dream?"
"I do not know," answered Solon, "but since that night I have been a poet."
"A poet?" screamed the little organ girl. "A real poet, who makes verses which everyone reads and everyone talks of?"
"The people call me a poet," answered Solon with a sad smile. "They do not know me by the name of Solon, for I write under an assumed title, but they praise me and repeat my songs. But, Zonella, I can't sing this load off my back, can I?"
"Oh, bother the hump,"
said Zonella, jumping up suddenly.
"You're a poet, and that's enough, isn't it? I'm so glad you're a poet, Solon. You must repeat all your best things to me, won't you?"
Solon nodded assent. "You don't ask me," he said, "who was the little girl that the hunchback loved?" Zonella's face flushed crimson. She turned suddenly away and ran into a dark corner of the room. In a moment she returned with an old hand-organ in her arms.
"Play, Solon, play," she cried. "I'm so glad that I want to dance. Furbelow, come and dance in honor of Solon the poet."
It was her confession. Solon's eyes flamed as if his brain had suddenly ignited. He said nothing, but a triumphant smile broke over his countenance. Zonella, the twilight of whose cheeks was still rosy with the setting blush, caught the lazy Furbelow by his little paws. Solon turned the crank of the organ, which wheezed out as merry a polka as its asthma would allow, and the girl and the monkey commenced their fantastic dance. They had taken but a few steps when the door suddenly opened, and the tall figure of the Wondersmith appeared on the threshold. His face was convulsed with rage, and the black snake that quivered on his upper lip seemed to rear itself as if about to spring upon the hunchback. 4. The Mannikins and the Minnows. The four gypsies left Herr Heap's house cautiously and directed their steps toward Mr. Pipple's bird shop. Galosh Street was asleep. Nothing was stirring in that tenebrous slum save a dog that savagely gnawed a bone which lay on a dust heap, tantalizing him with the flavor of food without its substance. As the gypsies moved stealthily along in the darkness, they had a sinister and murderous air that would not have failed to attract the attention of the policeman of the quarter, if that worthy had not at the moment been comfortably ensconced in the neighboring Rainbow bar-room, listening to the improvisations of that talented vocalist, Mr. Harrison, who was making impromptu verses on every possible subject, to the accompaniment of a cithern, which was played by a sad little Italian in a large cloak, to whom the host of the Rainbow gave so many toddies and $1 for his nightly performance. Mr. Pipple's shop was but a short distance from the Wondersmith's house. A few moments, therefore, brought the gypsy party to the door, when by the aid of a key, which Herr Heap produced, they silently slipped into the entry. Here the Wondersmith took a dark lantern from under his cloak, removed the cap that shrouded the light, and led the way into the shop, which was separated from the entry only by a glass door that yielded, like the outer one, to a key which Heap took from his pocket. The four gypsies now entered the shop and closed the door behind them. It was a little world of birds. On every side, whether in large or small cages, one beheld balls of various colored feathers standing on one leg and breathing peacefully. Lovebirds nestling shoulder to shoulder with their heads tucked under their wings and all their feathers puffed out, so that they looked like globes of malachite. English bullfinches with ashen-color backs in which their black heads were buried, and corselets of a rosy down. Java sparrows, fat and sleek and cleanly. Troupials, so glossy and splendid in plumage that they looked as if they were dressed in the celebrated armor of the Black Prince, which was jet, richly damascened with gold. a cock of the rock gleaming, a ball of tawny fire like a setting sun, the campanero of Brazil, white as snow, with his dilatable tolling tube hanging from his head, placid and silent. These, with a humbler crowd of linnets, canaries, robins, mockingbirds, and phoebes, slumbered calmly in their little cages that were hung so thickly on the wall as not to leave an inch of it visible.
"Splendid little morsels, all of them,"
exclaimed Monsieur Kerplan.
"Ah, we are going to have a rare beating."
"So Pipple does not sleep in his shop," said the English gypsy Oaksmith. "No, the fellow lives somewhere up one of the avenues," answered Madame Philomel. "He came the other evening to consult me about his fortune. I did not tell him," she added with a laugh, "that he was going to have so distinguished a sporting party on his premises."
"Come,"
said the Wondersmith, producing the box of mannikins.
"Get ready with souls, Madame Philomel. I am impatient to see my little men letting out lives for the first time."
Just at the moment that the Wondersmith uttered this sentence, the 4 gypsies were startled by a hoarse voice issuing from a corner of the room, and propounding in the most guttural tones the intemperate query of,
"What'll you take?"
The Scottish invitation had scarce been given, when a second extremely thick voice replied from an opposite corner, in accents so rough that they seemed to issue from a throat torn and furrowed by the liquid lava of many barrooms.
"Brandy and water." "Hallo, who's here?"
muttered Herr Heap, flashing the light of his lantern round the shop. Oaksmith turned up his coat cuffs as if to be ready for a fight. Madame Philomel glided, or rather rolled, towards the door, while Kerplan put his hand into his pocket, as if to assure himself that his supernumerary optic was all right.
"What'll you take?"
croaked the voice in the corner once more.
"Brandy and water,"
rapidly replied the second voice in the other corner. And then, as if by a concerted movement, a series of bibular invitations and acceptances were rolled backwards and forwards, with a volubility of utterance that threw patter versus clatter into the shade.
"What the devil can it be?"
muttered the Wondersmith, flashing his lantern here and there.
"Ah, it is those minos."
So saying, he stopped under one of the wicker cages that hung high up on the wall, and raised the lantern above his head so as to throw the light upon that particular cage. The hospitable individual who had been extending all these hoarse invitations to partake of intoxicating beverages was an inhabitant of the cage. It was a large minnow bird, who now stood perched on his crossbar with his yellowish-orange bill sloped slightly over his shoulder, and his white eye cocked knowingly upon the Wondersmith. The respondent voice in the other corner came from another minnow bird, who sat in the dusk in a similar cage, also attentively watching the Wondersmith. These minnow birds have a singular aptitude for acquiring phrases.
"What'll you take?"
repeated the minnow, cocking his other eye upon Herr Heap.
"Mon Dieu, what a bird!"
exclaimed the little Frenchman.
"He is in truth polite."
"I don't know what I'll take,"
said Heap, as if replying to the minnow bird.
"But I know what you'll get, old fellow. Philomel, open the cage doors and give me the bottle."
Philomel opened one after another the doors of the numberless little cages, thereby arousing from slumber their feathered occupants, who opened their beaks and stretched their claws, and stared with great surprise at the lantern and the midnight visitors. By this time the Wondersmith had performed the mysterious manipulations with the bottle, and the mannikins were once more in full motion, swarming out of their box, sword and dagger in hand, with their little black eyes glittering fiercely and their white teeth shining. The little creatures seemed to scent their prey. The gypsy stood in the center of the shop, watching the proceedings eagerly, while the Lilliputians made in a body toward the wall and commenced climbing from cage to cage. Then was heard a tremendous fluttering of wings, and faint, despairing quirks echoed on all sides. In almost every cage there was a fierce mannikin thrusting his sword or dagger vigorously into the body of some unhappy bird. It recalled the antique legend of the battles of pygmies and the cranes. The poor lovebirds lay with their emerald feathers dabbled in their heart's blood, shoulder to shoulder in death as in life. Canaries gasped at the bottom of their cages while the water in their little glass fountains ran red. The bullfinches wore an unnatural crimson on their breasts. The mockingbird lay on its back, kicking spasmodically in the last agonies, with a tiny sword thrust cleaving his melodious throat in twain, so that from the instrument which used to gush with wondrous music only scarlet drops of blood now trickled. The mannikins were ruthless. Their faces were 10 times wickeder than ever, as they roamed from cage to cage, slaughtering with a fury that seemed entirely unappeasable. Presently the feathery rustlings became fewer and fainter, and the little pipings of despair died away. And in every cage lay a poor murdered minstrel with the song that abode within him forever quenched. In every cage but 2, and those 2 were high up on the wall, and in each glare a pair of wild white eyes, and an orange beak tough as steel pointed threateningly down. With the needles which they grasped as swords all wet and warm with blood and their bead-like eyes flashing in the light of the lantern, the Lilliputian assassins swarmed up the cages in 2 separate bodies until they reached the wickets of the habitations in which the Minos abode. Minos saw them coming, had listened attentively to the many death struggles of his comrades, and had in fact smelt a rat. Accordingly, he was ready for the mannikins. There he stood at the barbican of his castle, with formidable beak couched like a lance. The mannikins made a gallant charge.
"What'll you take?"
was rattled out by the Mino in a deep bass, as with one plunge of his sharp bill he scattered the ranks of the enemy and sent 3 of them flying to the floor, where they lay with broken limbs. But the mannikins were brave automata, and again they closed and charged the gallant Mino. Again the wicked white eyes of the bird gleamed, and again the orange bill dealt destruction. Everything seemed to be going on swimmingly for Mino when he found himself attacked in the rear by 2 treacherous mannikins, who had stolen upon him from behind through the lattice-work of the cage. Quick as lightning, the Mino turned to repel this assault, but all too late. 2 slender, quivering threads of steel crossed in his poor body, and he staggered into a corner of the cage. His white eyes closed, then opened. A shiver passed over his body, beginning at his shoulder tips and dying off in the extreme tips of the wings. He gasped, as if for air, and then, with a convulsive shudder, which ruffled all his feathers, croaked out feebly his little speech.
"What'll you take?"
Instantly from the opposite corner came the old response, still feebler than the question, a more gurgle, as it were, of "Brandy water." Then all was silent. The Mino birds were dead.
"They spill blood like Christians,"
said the Wondersmith, gazing fondly on the mannikins.
"They will be famous assassins."
5. Tied up. Herr Heap stood in the doorway, scowling. His eyes seemed to scorch the poor hunchback, whose form, physically inferior, crouched before that baneful blazing glance, while its head, mentally brave, reared itself as if to redeem the cowardice of the frame to which it belonged. So the attitude of the serpent, the body pliant, yielding, supple, but the crest thrown aloft, erect and threatening. As for Zonella, she was frozen in the attitude of motion. A dancing nymph in colored marble, agility stunned, elasticity petrified. Furbelow, astonished at this sudden change and catching, with all the mysterious rapidity of instinct peculiar to the lower animals, at the enigmatical character of the situation, turned his pleading melancholy eyes from one to another of the motionless 3, as if begging that his humble intellect, pardon me, naturalist, for the use of this word intellect in the matter of a monkey, should be enlightened as speedily as possible. Not receiving the desired information, he, after the manner of trained animals, returned to his muttons. In other words, he conceived that this unusual entrance and consequent dramatic tableau meant shop. He therefore dropped Zonella's hand and pattered on his velvety little feet over towards the grim figure of the Wondersmith, holding out his poor little paw for the customary copper. He had but one idea drilled into him, soulless creature that he was, and that was alms. But I have seen creatures that professed to have souls, and that would have been indignant if you had denied them immortality, who took the soliciting of alms as naturally as if beggary had been the original sin, and was regularly born with them, and never baptized out of them. I will give these bandits of the Order of Charity this credit, however, that they knew the best highways and the richest founts of benevolence, unlike to Furbelow, who, unreasoning and undiscriminating, begged from the first person that was near. Furbelow, owing to this intellectual inferiority to the before-mentioned Alsatians, frequently got more kicks than coppers, and the present supplication which he indulged in toward the Wondersmith was a terrible confirmation of the rule. The reply to the extended pleading paw was what might be called a double-barreled kick, a kick to be represented by the power of 2 when the foot touched the object, multiplied by 4 when the entire leg formed an angle of 45 degrees with the spinal column. The long, nervous leg of the Wondersmith caught the little creature in the center of the body, doubled up his brown, hairy form till he looked like a fur driving glove, and sent him whizzing across the room into a far corner, where he dropped senseless and flaccid. This vengeance which Herr Heap executed upon Furbelow seemed to have operated as a sort of escape valve, and he found voice. He hissed out the question,
"Who are you?"
to the hunchback, and in listening to that essence of sibilation it really seemed as if it proceeded from the serpent that curled upon his upper lip.
"Who are you? Deformed dog, who are you? What do you here?"
"My name is Solon," answered the fearless head of the hunchback, while the frail, cowardly body shivered and trembled inch by inch into a corner.
"So you come to visit my daughter in the night-time, when I am away?"
continued the Wondersmith with a sneering tone that dropped from his snake-wreathed mouth like poison.
You are a brave and gallant lover, are you not? Where did you win that order of the curse of God that decorates your shoulders? The women turn their heads and look after you in the street when you pass, do they not? Lost in admiration of that symmetrical figure, those graceful limbs, that neck pliant as the stem that moors the lotus. Elegant, conquering Christian cripple, what do you hear in my daughter's room?
Can you imagine Jove, limitless in power and wrath, hurling from his vast grasp mountain after mountain upon the struggling Enceladus, and picture the Titan sinking deeper and deeper into the earth, crushed and dying with nothing visible through the superincumbent masses of Pelion and Ossa, but a gigantic head and 2 flaming eyes that, despite the death which is creeping through each vein, still flash back defiance to the divine enemy? Well, Solon and Herr Heap presented such a picture, seen through the wrong end of a telescope, reduced in proportion, but alike in action. Solon's feeble body seemed to sink into utter annihilation beneath the horrible taunts that his enemy hurled at him, while the large brave brow and unconquered eyes still sent forth a magnetic resistance. Suddenly the poor hunchback felt his arm grasped. A thrill seemed to run through his entire body. A warm atmosphere, invigorating and full of delicious odor, surrounded him. It appeared as if invisible bandages were twisting all around his limbs, giving him a strange strength. His sinking legs straightened. His powerless arms were braced. Astonished, he glanced round for an instant and beheld Zonella, with a world of love burning in her large lambent eyes, wreathing her round white arms about his humped shoulders. Then the poet knew the great sustaining power of love. Solon reared himself boldly. "Sneer at my poor form," he cried in strong vibrating tones, flinging out one long arm and one thin finger at the Wondersmith, as if he would have impaled him like a beetle. "Humiliate me if you can. I care not. You are a wretch, and I am honest and pure. This girl is not your daughter. You are like one of those demons in the fairy tales that held beauty and purity locked in infernal spells. I do not fear you, Herr Heap. There are stories abroad about you in the neighborhood, and when you pass, people say that they feel evil and blight hovering over their thresholds. You persecute this girl. You are her tyrant. You hate her. I am a cripple. Providence has cast this lump upon my shoulders, but that is nothing. The camel, that is the salvation of the children of the desert, has been given his hump in order that he might bear his human burden better. This girl, who is homeless as the Arab, is my appointed load in life, and please God I will carry her on this back, hunched though it may be. I have come to see her because I love her, because she loves me. You have no claim on her, so I will take her from you." Quick as lightning, the Wondersmith had stridden a few paces, and grasped the poor cripple who was yet quivering with the departing thunder of his passion. He seized him in his bony, muscular grasp, as he would have seized a puppet, and held him at arm's length, gasping and powerless, while Zonella, pale, breathless, entreating, sank half-kneeling on the floor.
"Your skeleton will be interesting to science when you are dead, Mr. Solon," hissed the Wondersmith. "But before I have the pleasure of reducing you to an anatomy, which I will assuredly do, I wish to compliment you on your power of penetration, or sources of information, for I know not if you have derived your knowledge from your own mental research or the efforts of others. You're perfectly correct in your statement that this charming young person who day after day parades the streets with a barrel organ and a monkey, the last unhappily indisposed at present, listening to the degrading jokes of ribald boys and depraved men. You are quite correct, sir, in stating that she is not my daughter. On the contrary, she is the daughter of an Hungarian nobleman who had the misfortune to incur my displeasure. I had a son, crooked spawn of a Christian. A son not like you. Cankered, gnarled stump of life that you are. But a youth tall and fair and noble in aspect as became a child of one whose lineage makes Pharaoh modern. A youth whose foot in the dance was as swift and beautiful to look at as the gold sandals of the sun when he dances upon the sea in summer. This youth was virtuous and good, and being of good race and dwelling in a country where his rank, gypsy as he was recognized, he mixed with the proudest of the land. One day he fell in with this accursed Hungarian, a fierce drinker of that devil's blood called brandy. My child until that hour had avoided this bane of our race, Generous wine he drank because the soul of the sun, our ancestor, palpitated in its purple waves. But brandy which is fallen and accursed wine, as devils are fallen and accursed angels, had never crossed his lips until in an evil hour he was seduced by this Christian hog. And from that day forth his life was one fiery debauch, which set only in the black waves of death. I vowed vengeance on the destroyer of my child, and I kept my word. I have destroyed his child, not compassed her death, but blighted her life, steeped her in misery and poverty. And now, thanks to the 1,000 devils, I have discovered a new torture for her heart. She thought to solace her life with a love episode. Sweet little epicure that she was. She shall have her little crooked lover, shan't she? Oh, yes, she shall have him, cold and stark and livid, with that great black heavy hunch which no back, however broad, can bear. Death sitting between his shoulders.
There was something so awful and demoniac in this entire speech and the manner in which it was delivered, that it petrified Zonella into a mere inanimate figure, whose eyes seemed unalterably fixed on the fierce, cruel face of the Wondersmith. As for Solon, he was paralyzed in the grasp of his foe. He heard but could not reply. His large eyes, dilated with horror to far beyond their ordinary size, expressed unutterable agony. The last sentence had hardly been hissed out by the gypsy when he took from his pocket a long, thin coil of whipcord, which he entangled in a complicated mesh around the cripple's body. It was not the ordinary binding of a prisoner. The slender lash passed and repassed in 1,000 intricate folds over the powerless limbs of the poor hunchback. When the operation was completed, he looked as if he had been sewed from head to foot in some singularly ingenious species of network.
"Now, my pretty, lopsided little lover,"
laughed Herr Heap, flinging Solon over his shoulder as a fisherman might fling a net full of fish,
"we will proceed to put you into your little cage until your little coffin is quite ready. Meanwhile, we will lock up your darling beggar girl to mourn over your untimely end."
So saying, he stepped from the room with his captive and securely locked the door behind him. When he had disappeared, the frozen Zonella thawed, and with a shriek of anguish flung herself on the inanimate body of Furbelow. 6. The Poisoning of the Swords. It was New Year's Eve and 11 o'clock at night. All over this great land, and in every great city in the land, curly heads were lying on white pillows, dreaming of the coming of the generous Santa Claus. Innumerable stockings hung by countless bedsides. Visions of beautiful toys passing in splendid pageantry through myriads of dimly lit dormitories made millions of little hearts palpitate in sleep. Ah, what heavenly toys those were that the children of this soil beheld that mystic night in their dreams! Painted cars with orchestral wheels making music more delicious than the roll of planets. Agile men of cylindrical figure who sprang unexpectedly out of meek-looking boxes with a supernatural fierceness in their crimson cheeks and fur whiskers. Herds of marvelous sheep with fleeces as impossible as the one that Jason sailed after. Animals entirely indifferent to grass and water and rot and ticks. Horses spotted with an astounding regularity and furnished with the most ingenious methods of locomotion. Slender foreigners, attired in painfully short tunics, whose existence passed in continuously turning heels overhead down a steep flight of steps, at the bottom of which they lay in an exhausted condition with dislocated limbs, until they were restored to their former elevation, when they went at it again as if nothing had happened. Stately swans that seemed to have a touch of the ostrich in them, for they swam continually after a piece of iron which was held before them, as if consumed with a ferruginous hunger. Whole farmyards of roosters whose tails curled the wrong way, a slight defect that was, however, amply atoned for by the size and brilliancy of their scarlet combs, which, it would appear, Providence had intended for pen-wipers. Pears that, when applied to youthful lips, gave forth sweet and inspiring sounds. Regiments of soldiers that performed neat but limited evolutions on cross-jointed contractile battlefields. All these things idealized, transfigured, and illuminated by the powers and atmosphere and colored lamps of dreamland, did the millions of dear sleeping children behold the night of the New Year's Eve of which I speak. It was on this night when Time was preparing to shed his skin, and come out young and golden and glossy as ever, when in the vast chambers of the universe silent and infallible preparations were making for the wonderful birth of the coming year, when mystic dews were secreted for his baptism, and mystic instruments were tuned in space to welcome him. It was at this holy and solemn hour that the Wondersmith and his 3 gypsy companions sat in close conclave in the little parlour before mentioned. There was a fire roaring in the grate. On a table nearly in the centre of the room stood a huge decanter of port wine that glowed in the blaze which lit the chamber like a flask of crimson fire. On every side, piled in heaps, inanimate but scowling with the same old wondrous scowl, lay myriads of mannikins, all clutching in their wooden hands their tiny weapons. The Wondersmith held in one hand a small silver bowl filled with a green, glutinous substance, which he was delicately applying with the aid of a camel's hair brush to the tips of tiny swords and daggers. A horrible smile wandered over his sallow face, a smile as unwholesome in appearance as the sickly light that played above reeking graveyards.
"Let us drink great draughts, brothers," he cried, leaving off his strange anointment for a while to lift a great glass filled with sparkling liquor to his lips. "Let us drink to our approaching triumph. Let us drink to the great poison, Makusha, subtle seed of death, swift hurricane that sweeps away life, vast hammer that crushes brain and heart and artery was its resistless weight. I drink to it."
"It is a noble decoction, Duke Balthazar," said the old fortune-teller and midwife, Madame Philomel, nodding in her chair as she swallowed her wine in great gulps. "Where did you obtain it?"
"It is made,"
said the Wondersmith, swallowing another great draught of wine ere he replied,
"in the wild woods of Guyana, in silence and in mystery. But one tribe of Indians, the Makushi Indians, know the secret. It is simmered over fires built of strange woods, and the maker of it dies in the making. The place for a mile around the spot where it is fabricated is shunned as accursed. Devils hover over the spot in which it stews, and the birds of the air, scenting the smallest breath of its vapor from far away, drop to the earth with paralyzed wings, cold and dead."
"It kills then fast?"
asked Kerplon, the artificial eye-maker, his own eyes gleaming under the influence of the wine with a sinister luster, as if they had been fresh from the factory, and were yet untarnished by use.
"Kills," echoed the Wondersmith derisively. "It is swifter than thunderbolts, stronger than lightning. But you shall see it prove before we let forth our army on the city accursed. You shall see a wretch die as if smitten by a falling fragment of the sun."
"What? Do you mean Solon?" asked Oatsmith and the fortune-teller together.
"Ah, you mean the young man who makes the commerce with books,"
echoed Kerplon.
"It is well. His agonies will instruct us."
"Yes, Solon,"
answered Heap, with a savage accent.
"I hate him, and he shall die this horrid death. Ah, how the little fellows will leap upon him when I bring him in, bound and helpless, and give their beautiful wicked souls to them. How they will pierce him in 10,000 spots with their poisoned weapons until his skin turns blue and violet and crimson, and his form swells with the venom until his hump is lost in shapeless flesh. He hears what I say, every word of it. He is in the closet next door and is listening. How comfortable he feels, how the sweat of terror rolls on his brow, how he tries to loosen his bonds and curses all earth and heaven when he finds that he cannot. Ho, ho! Handsome lover of Zonella, will she kiss you when you are livid and swollen. Brothers, let us drink again. Drink always. Here, Oaksmith, take these brushes, and you, Philomel, and finish the anointing of these swords. This wine is grand. This poison is grand. It is fine to have good wine to drink and good poison to kill with, is it not?"
And with flushed face and rolling eyes, the Wondersmith continued to drink and use his brush alternately. The others hastened to follow his example. It was a horrible scene. Those 4 wicked faces, those myriads of tiny faces, just as wicked, the certain unearthly air that pervaded the apartment, the red unwholesome glare cast by the fire, the wild and reckless way in which the weird company drank the red illumined wine. The anointing of the swords went on rapidly, and the wine went as rapidly down the throats of the 4 poisoners. Their faces grew more and more inflamed each instant. Their eyes shone like rolling fireballs. Their hair was moist and disheveled. The old fortune-teller rocked to and fro in her chair like those legless plaster figures that sway upon convex loaded bottoms. All 4 began to mutter incoherent sentences and babble unintelligible wickednesses. Still the anointing of the swords went on.
"I see the faces of millions of young corpses,"
babbled Herr Heap, gazing with swimming eyes into the silver bowl that contained the Makusha poison.
"All young, all Christians, and the little fellows dancing and stabbing. Philomel, I say!"
"Well, Grand Duke," snored the old woman, giving a violent lurch.
"Where's the bottle of souls?"
"In my right-hand pocket, Herr Heap," and she felt so as to assure herself that it was there. She half drew out the black bottle before described in this narrative, and let it slide again into her pocket. Let it slide again, but it did not completely regain its former place. Caught by some accident, it hung halfway out, swaying over the edge of the pocket as the fat midwife rolled backwards and forwards in her drunken efforts at equilibrium.
"All right,"
said Herr Heap.
"Perfectly right. Let's drink."
He reached out his hand for his glass, and with a dull sigh dropped on the table in the instantaneous slumber of intoxication. Oaksmith soon fell back in his chair, breathing heavily. Corplon followed, and the heavy stertorous breathing of Philomel told that she slumbered also, but still her chair retained its rocking motion, and still the bottle of souls balanced itself on the edge of her pocket. 7. Let loose. Sure enough, Solon heard every word of the fiendish talk of the Wondersmith. For how many days he had been shut up, bound in the terrible net in that dark closet he did not know. But now he felt that his last hour was come. His little strength was completely worn out in efforts to disentangle himself. Once a day, a door opened, and Herr Heap placed a crust of bread and a cup of water within his reach. On this meager fare he had subsisted. It was a hard life, but bad as it was better than the horrible death that menaced him. His brain reeled with terror at the prospect of it. Then, where was Zonella? Why did she not come to his rescue? But she was, perhaps, dead. The darkness, too, appalled him. A faint light, when the moon was bright, came at night through a chink far up in the wall, and the only other hole in the chamber was an aperture through which, at some former time, a stovepipe had been passed. Even if he were free, there would have been small hope of escape. But laced, as it were, in a network of steel, what was to be done? He groaned and writhed upon the floor and tore at the boards with his hands, which were free from the wrists down. All else was as solidly laced up as an Indian papoose. Nothing but pride kept him from shrieking aloud when, on the night of New Year's Eve, he heard the fiendish Heap recite the programme of his murder. When he was thus wailing and gnashing his teeth in darkness and torture, he heard a faint noise above his head. Then something seemed to leap from the ceiling, and alight softly on the floor. He shuddered with terror. Was it some new torture of the Wondersmith's invention? The next moment he felt some small animal crawling over his body, and a soft, silky paw was pushed timidly across his face. His heart leaped with joy. "It is Furbelow," he cried. "Zonella has sent him. He came through the stovepipe hole." It was Furbelow, indeed, restored to life by Zonella's care, and who had come down a narrow tube that no human being could have threaded to console the poor captive. The monkey nestled closely into the hunchback's bosom, and as he did so, Solon felt something cold and hard hanging from his neck. He touched it. It was sharp. By the dim light that struggled through the aperture high up in the wall, he discovered a knife suspended by a bit of cord. Ah! How the blood came rushing through the veins that crossed over and through his heart when life and liberty came to him in this bit of rusty steel. With his manacled hands he loosened the heaven-sent weapon. A few cuts were rapidly made in the cunning network of cord that enveloped his limbs, and in a few seconds he was free. Cramped and faint with hunger, but free. Free to move, to use the limbs that God had given him for his preservation. Free to fight, to die fighting, perhaps, but still to die free. He ran to the door. The bolt was a weak one, for the Wondersmith had calculated more surely on his prison of cords than on any jail of stone, and with a few efforts the door opened. He went cautiously out into the darkness, with Furbelow perched on his shoulder, pressing his cold muzzle against his cheek. He had made but a few steps when a trembling hand was put into his, and in another moment Zonella's palpitating heart was pressed against his own. One long kiss, an embrace, a few whispered words, and the hunchback and the girl stole softly toward the door of the chamber in which the 4 gypsies slept. All seemed still. Nothing but the hard breathing of the sleepers and the monotonous rocking of Madame Philomel's chair broke the silence. Solon stooped down and put his eye to the keyhole, through which a red bar of light streamed into the entry. As he did so, his foot crushed some brittle substance that lay just outside the door. At the same moment, a howl of agony was heard to issue from the room within. Solon started, nor did he know that at that instant he had crushed into dust Monsieur Corplon's supernumerary eye, and the owner, though wrapped in a drunken sleep, felt the pain quiver through his brain. While Solon peeped through the keyhole, all in the room was motionless. He had not gazed, however, for many seconds when the chair of the fortune-teller gave a sudden lurch, and the black bottle, already hanging half out of her wide pocket, slipped entirely from its resting-place, and falling heavily to the ground, shivered into fragments. Then took place an astonishing spectacle. The myriads of armed dolls that lay in piles about the room became suddenly imbued with motion. They stood up straight, their tiny limbs moved, their black eyes flashed with wicked purposes, their thread-like swords gleamed as they waved them to and fro. The villainous souls imprisoned in the bottle began to work within them. Like the Lilliputians when they found the giant Gulliver asleep, they scaled in swarms the burly sides of the 4 sleeping gypsies. At every step they took, they drove their thin swords and quivering daggers into the flesh of the drunken authors of their being. To stab and kill was their mission, and they stabbed and killed with incredible fury. They clustered on the Wondersmith's sallow cheeks and sinewy throat, piercing every portion with their diminutive poisoned blades. Philomel's fat carcass was alive with them. They blackened the spare body of Monsieur Courpelon. They covered Oaksmith's huge form like a cluster of insects. Overcome completely with the fumes of wine, these tiny wounds did not for a few moments awaken the sleeping victims, but the swift and deadly poison makusha, with which the weapons had been so fiendishly anointed, began to work. Herr Heap, stung into sudden life, leaped to his feet, with a dwarf army clinging to his clothes and his hands, always stabbing, stabbing, stabbing. For an instant a look of stupid bewilderment clouded his face. Then the horrible truth burst upon him. He gave a shriek like that which a horse utters when he finds himself fettered and surrounded by fire. A shriek that curdled the air for miles and miles.
"Oaksmith! Courpelon! Philomel! Awake, awake! We are lost! The souls have got loose! We are dead, poisoned! Oh, accursed ones! Oh, demons! Ye are slaying me! Ah, fiends of hell!"
Aroused by these frightful howls, the 3 gypsies sprang also to their feet, to find themselves stung to death by the mannikins. They raved, they shrieked, they swore, they staggered round the chamber, blinded in the eyes by the ever-stabbing weapons, with the poison already burning in their veins like red-hot lead, their forms swelling and discoloring visibly every moment. Their howls and attitudes and furious gestures made the scene look like a chamber in hell. Maddened beyond endurance, the Wondersmith, half blind and choking with the venom that had congested all the blood vessels of his body, seized dozens of the mannikins and dashed them into the fire, trampling them down with his feet.
"Ye shall die too if I die,"
he cried with a roar like that of a tiger.
"Ye shall burn if I burn. I gave ye life, I give ye death. Down, down, burn, flame! Fiends that ye are to slay us. Help me, brothers. Before we die, let us have our revenge."
On this, the other gypsies, themselves maddened by approaching death, began hurling mannikins by handfuls into the fire. The little creatures, being wooden of body, quickly caught the flames, and an awful struggle for life took place in miniature in the grate. Some of them escaped from between the bars and ran about the room, blazing, writhing in agony, and igniting the curtains and other draperies that hung around. Others fought and stabbed one another in the very core of the fire, like combating salamanders. Meantime, the motions of the gypsies grew more languid and slow, and their curses were uttered in choked guttural tones. The faces of all 4 were spotted with red and green and violet, like so many eggplants. Their bodies were swollen to a frightful size, and at last they dropped on the floor, like overripe fruit shaken from the boughs by the winds of autumn. The chamber was now a sheet of fire. The flames roared round and round, as if seeking for escape, licking every projecting cornice and sill with greedy tongues, as the serpent licks his prey before he swallows it. A hot putrid breath came through the keyhole, and smote Solon and Zanella like a wind of death. They clasped each other's hands with a moan of terror, and fled from the house. The next morning, when the young year was just unclosing its eyes, and the happy children all over the great city were peeping from their beds into the myriads of stockings hanging nearby, the blue skies of heaven shone through a black network of stone and charred rafters. These were all that remained of the habitation of Herr Heap, the Wondersmith. End of section 2.